All right, so as Monica mentioned, Joitree, who is our next speaker, is not able to be with us in person, so she pre-recorded a talk that I will pull up now.
History of Photographic Paper Manufacturers: How Innovation, Conflict, and Business Have Shaped Paper. As a research lab dedicated to the preservation of Black and white photography from the 20th century, a large part of our work is understanding everything around the paper. This not only lends to the accuracy of our data, but also adds rich context to the papers and sample books in our collection. One of my main focus during my postgraduate associateship has been doing research into photographic paper manufacturers. It's important to have a comprehensive understanding of these companies, because not only does it give context to the papers, but it also gives us a deeper understanding of the different innovations and trends in the industry and photography as a whole. So this research accumulated in two main projects. The first is a Story Maps website delineating the history of photographic paper manufacturers, and the second was the undertaking of rechecking the dates of our papers for Paperbase. While working on these projects, I found myself gravitating towards three aspects of historical research. The first is photographic paper innovation, the second is global historical context, and the third is corporate history. And I'll be touching on all of these through this presentation. So Kodak is a really strong example of having a really rich history in paper innovation. Founded in 1880 out in Rochester, New York, Kodak has long been an innovator in the photography market, and this absolutely extended to paper. In the mid-1930s, Kodak was the first American photographic paper manufacturer to mass-produce photographic raw stock paper in the United States, which was previously only sourced from Europe. So American companies like Kodak would buy the paper, usually from paper mills out in Germany and France, and then ship it to the United States and then add their own emulsions. And this became increasingly complicated since Kodak was growing at an exponential rate. They would often have to order the paper almost a year in advance. So the papers that you see up on the screen, which the Deco on the left and the Solio on the right, are examples of papers that were, the base was made out in Europe and then emulsions added in the United States. So according to Kit Funderburk, in a guide to surface characteristics, Kodak's fiber-based black and white papers, Kodak started experimenting with creating their own paper in-house in 1914. This ended in several hundred rolls of botched raw photographic raw paper. With continued experimentation, the first roll of usable paper was produced in March 1915. Kodak's timing was perfect since World War I had halted European raw stock paper production. It's important to note, though, that Kodak had a lot of backup European raw stock paper, and this was really important given that the paper that they made in March just wasn't high quality. They're running into issues of dark spots and curling, and all Kodak could really do was hide the imperfections with a really thick layer of Baryta. And it wasn't until the mid-1920s that Kodak, in conjunction with their collaborators at the Brown Paper Company, that they started looking into wood pulp. And then by 1931, all of Kodak's photographic papers were made with 100% high alpha wood pulp. So throughout this process, Kodak experimented with different textures and finishes of their papers. Given Kodak's extensive archives and Kit Funderburk's research, I was able to delve into some of the interesting textures that Kodak was able to produce. And then on a more technical note, this also significantly helped me when it came to dating some of the papers in our collection. So I have a couple examples for you guys. The first is linen, which was produced from 1921 to 1935. And the paper here was embossed and given that window or waffle type pattern, which you can see in the texture close-up right there. Then we have the iconic velvet, which is from 1905 to 1937. So with velvet, they just let the Baryta layer dry as is. They didn't go and smooth it out or shake it out. They just let it be as is. And this would lead the paper and the images to have a really soft, rich, almost blurry, dreamlike quality to it. And then we have one of my personal favorite, which is suede, which was from 1940 to 1972. So this was really meant to mimic leather. So it's characterized by having kind of this light texture, which you can see on the screen. It's really matte and reflectiveless, not unlike our leather goods. And they're able to get this effect by adding a matting agent at the end of the process. So while Kodak has a really extensive archive regarding their innovations, Many times companies just don't have that information, or that information just isn't as readily accessible. So this is when I had to find different threads to follow that would give me a different perspective on these companies and their papers. What was interesting is that I couldn't help but notice how these manufacturers were often intersecting with global conflicts. It's important to remember that these companies didn't just exist in a bubble. They often played active roles in major global conflicts. So this not only unearthed really interesting and important stories, but also, in a technical note, also helped me date the papers. So a perfect example of this is AGFA. So AGFA was founded in 1867 out in Germany as a color dye factory that began developing some photographic materials on the side. In 1926, they came together with a few other German companies and created IG Farben Industry. Under IG Farben, AGFA began to solely produce photographic materials. They produced through World War II, and the end of World War II in 1944 led to massive changes for AGFA. It's important to acknowledge that AGFA produced for and benefited greatly from the Nazi government. For instance, AGFA Commando was a labor camp where they used slave labor for their camera production. After World War II, IG Farben's companies were all found guilty during the Nuremberg military trials. Specifically, under case number 6, Fritz Gajowski, chief of Division 3 AGFA, was indicted in Nuremberg, as well as almost every plant leader in the AGFA network. So using history provided by Bayer AG, the book Milestones, The Bayer Story, 1863 to 1988 by Eric Berg, Gottfried Plump, and Heinz Schulthries, as well as some random loose leaf notes in the lab, a full picture of what happened to AGFA after World War II took shape. So after the war, American troops handed over Leverkusen, AGFA's paper base, to the British troops. In this period, roughly from 1945 to 1952, AGFA produced under AGFA Photo Fabric, which you can see in the package to the right. You can see it in this oval outline right here. So this was really the only change that the British made to the iconic orange AGFA packaging. So before AGFA was taken over by the Allies, so pre-end of World War II, they instead had IG Farben Industry Akten Gesellschaft in that oval outline, which you can see in the package on the left. So the original plan for IG Farben by the Allies was to break it into as many small companies as possible, but there was really no way that would lead to viable companies. So instead, they created 12 new competitive companies that would help uphold the economy. So one of the 12 companies was Farben Fabriken Bayer AG, or Bayer, and they allocated AGFA as a subsidiary of Bayer in 1952, which they are to this day. So roughly from 1952 to 1964, papers from this period can be identified by the AGFA AG for photo fabrication, again in this oval outline with the paper on the left. The last loose end was that the original AGFA network had been split in half by West and East Germany. There was still the Wolfen plant, which was solidly situated in the Soviet zone. There was nearly 20 years of back and forth, with the Wolfen plant wanting to use the prestigious AGFA name. Eventually, in 1964, AGFA paid off the Wolfen site, and the East German enterprise started producing under Orwo. And we have an Orwo package on the right here. This was also the same year that AGFA merged with Belgian photographic paper manufacturer Gevaer, creating AGFA Gevaer. So this history also lends itself to the third aspect of historical research that I got into, which was corporate history. So it's not often that we think about corporate history when we look at photographic paper. I know I didn't. But what I found was that the paper and the inner workings of the companies are intrinsically related. Fuji was a really interesting case because by all means, they were a company that wasn't meant to survive post-World War II, but they were able to make a really strong comeback due to well-made corporate decisions and innovations. Founded in the 1930s, Kodak was established as one of the few companies founded under a Japanese government plan to establish a domestic source for photographic goods. So before 1934, they were a subsidiary of Daicel Chemical Industries. And then in 1934, they were able to peel off on their own. And I just want to shout out that when looking into Fuji's early history, I found Lutz Alt's dissertation, The Photochemical Industry, Historical Essays in Business Strategy and Internationalization, incredibly helpful. So according to Alt, Fuji initially struggled to win acceptance among the competitive 1930s market in Japan. So they were competing with really well-established companies like AGFA and Kodak, but they gradually began to win acceptance. But it also didn't hurt that in 1937, the Japanese government placed a total embargo on the importation of all photographic products. Fuji had a reputation for having a really energetic and effective management, which put them in circles of high government, allowing them to play a massive role for Japan during World War II. So it was this energetic and effective management that helped them have a strong comeback in the post-war period. So one of the things they did is, in a rapidly globalizing market of the 1950s, Fuji focused on dominating only the domestic Japanese market. So with the resources and the funds that they could have used to expand to other countries, they instead spent time on solidifying their product and making a really superior quality good. So one thing that they really doubled down on was quality control. And it was in this period that Fuji created a device, Fuji C, which you see on the left, which was a precursor of the modern computer. And this was to help with quality control in the production plants of film and paper. On the marketing end, as photography became more widespread in Japan as the economy was bouncing back, Fuji focused on domestic mass distribution, rather than only focusing on going through specialty stores like they had done previously. And it was in this late 1950s, early 1960s era that Fuji took on their characteristic green package color, which we see really vividly on the right on the screen. And, the screen is really similar to how Kodak had their iconic gold packages and AGFA had their really iconic kind of bright orange packages. So it was this care that they put in their domestic market that allowed Fuji to defend their market in Japan while also building a strong international presence when they were ready. So interestingly, Fuji's first point of international expansion was Brazil, partially because it was a market that was massively untapped, but also there was a large Japanese population out in Brazil. In the early 20th century, many Japanese nationals immigrate to Brazil as contracted agricultural workers. Once in Brazil, they would often take loans from the Japanese Overseas Development Corporation and move to urban areas to start small businesses. One of the small business sectors that the Japanese Brazilians were able to grow into was photography. So Fuji Photo Film Brazil Limited was formally established in August 1958. And after this was a success, Fuji expanded into Europe and the United States quite quickly by the late 1960s. In the 1960s, Japan had also opened their photography market back to non-Japanese companies, and Kodak was back in Japan. And it was clear initially that Kodak's prestige hadn't really suffered. So in their article, Fujifilm Kodak Duopolistic Competition in Japan and the United States for the Journal of International Business Studies, Yoshi Tsurumi and Hiroki Tsurumi delved into the relationship between the two companies. In Japan, both Kodak and Fuji were initially considered superior quality goods, which are goods that are linked to an upscale or fashionable lifestyle. But Fuji was still outselling Kodak nearly 7-1, even though Fuji's prices were significantly higher. So it's important to note that Japanese consumers very, very, very strongly equated higher price to higher quality. And Kodak didn't realize how serious that was. And so when Kodak went to cut their prices like they would if they were in the United States, they instead ended up harming their brand image. So the last nail in the coffin was Fuji rolling out their mini photo finishing labs, or the mini labs, in 1975. These labs quickly and efficiently printed photographs from film. So while these labs could process film from many companies like Kodak and AGFA, it used Fuji products and papers. And these mini labs really only need to be staffed by one person and can be leased out by independent retailers. So on the left, we have an analog mini lab, which I believe is kind of an earlier version. And then so that's on the left. And then on the right, we have a digital mini lab. And those started rolling out in the 80s and 90s. So while Fuji dominated the Japanese market, they really wanted to start dominating to further grow into the United States in the mid-1980s. So by the 1980s, Americans were more open to Japanese products, and Fuji very much leaned into that in their marketing. They worked with large events and companies to get the company name out there. So they worked with the NBA and the Olympics, and you see an advertisement from the '84 Olympics on the left. So this, in conjunction with Fuji expanding to over 70,000 retail outlets, allowed Fuji to have a really significant toehold in the American market. And by 1988, they had a massive manufacturing plant out in Greenwood, South Carolina, and they began manufacturing color paper out there in 1994. So the package on the right is a package that was actually made in the Greenwood, South Carolina plants. So while I really only talked about 3 major photographic paper manufacturers, there are many more stories about these companies and their papers. I have more essays and case studies on photographic paper manufacturers in my ArcGIS Story Maps website, which is playing on the screen right now. I remember my first week, I was given this Excel sheet of manufacturers to start delving into, and never would I have expected to find the stories that I did. In exploring the histories of key photographic paper manufacturers, I've seen how these companies have navigated the challenges of innovation, market competition, and geopolitical upheaval. Each company's story highlights the resilience and ingenuity that shaped the photographic industry. And here is the QR code if you all are interested in delving into the story maps. Thank you so much.